I was standing at my own wedding reception when my mother grabbed the microphone and destroyed everything. 200 guests fell silent. The DJ's music cut out. My white dress suddenly felt like a target. "You'll never amount to anything," her voice cracked through the speakers, slurred and vicious. "You've always been nothing." For 26 years, I had been invisible in my own family. Every report card ignored, every achievement dismissed, every dream mocked while my brother was celebrated for simply existing. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine. I saw my mother-in-law's mouth fall open in horror. I heard whispers spreading like fire through the tables, and I smiled. Because she didn't know about the envelope in my purse, the one containing 7 years of secrets, the one that would make 200 guests see my mother for exactly who she was. I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking against the terrible silence. 6 words. That's all it would take to change everything. Have you ever been publicly destroyed by the one person who was supposed to love you most? My name is Amber Craig. I'm 36 years old, a senior financial analyst at a firm in Columbus, and for 26 years I have been the invisible daughter of Linda Mitchell. That morning, the morning of my wedding, I stood in front of the bridal suite mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. The dress was beautiful, the makeup was perfect, but my hands weren't shaking because of the ceremony ahead. They were shaking because of the thick envelope tucked inside my purse on the vanity. Daniel knocked and entered without waiting. We weren't superstitious about traditions. After what we'd both survived with our families, we didn't believe in luck anymore. We believed in choices. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly, standing behind me in the mirror. "Once you do it, there's no going back." I met his eyes in the reflection. Daniel had walked away from his own toxic parents 5 years ago. He understood what it cost to love people who refused to love you back. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. "I've been going back for 26 years, I said. "Today I finally go forward." He kissed my forehead and left me alone with my thoughts. And in the silence, the memories came flooding back like water through a cracked dam. I was 10 years old when my father died. A heart attack, sudden and merciless, in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. One moment he was reading in his study. The next moment he was gone, and everything I knew about family went with him. After that, my mother changed. She looked at my younger brother Eric and saw my father's eyes, my father's smile, my father's legacy. She looked at me and saw nothing worth keeping. Eric got celebration dinners for C- report cards. My straight A's were met with silence. When I was 12, I saved $200 from babysitting to buy new glasses because mine had been broken for 6 months. The money disappeared from my dresser. A week later, Eric had new basketball shoes. When I asked my mother what happened, she didn't even look up from the stove. "He needed them for tryouts. You can tape your glasses." That was the day I learned the truth about my place in this family. My needs didn't exist. My dreams didn't matter. I was simply the one who could be ignored. I left home at 18 with a scholarship, 3 part-time jobs, and exactly $0 from my mother. I put myself through college. I built a career. I saved money with the discipline of someone who knew that no one was coming to save her. By 30, I had a good job, a nice apartment, and savings that most people my age couldn't imagine. Meanwhile, Eric dropped out of college, failed 3 businesses, and divorced 2 wives. My mother had an excuse for every disaster. He was finding himself. Those women didn't appreciate him. College wasn't for everyone, and me, I was the one who doesn't need help, which really meant the one we don't have to care about. But here's what nobody knew. 7 years ago, my mother mortgaged our family home to fund Eric's first business. When it failed, foreclosure was 60 days away. I could have let it happen. Part of me wanted to. But then I thought about my father's study, his books still on the shelves, his reading chair by the window, the oak tree he planted in the backyard the year I was born, now towering over the fence. If the bank took that house, I would lose the last pieces of him. So I bought the mortgage debt myself, quietly, anonymously, through a lawyer and an LLC with a name that sounded like a government program. For 7 years, I paid for everything, the house, the taxes, Eric's debts. $183,000. And they never knew. They never thanked me. They never even saw me. Until 2 weeks ago, when my mother called to demand I add Eric's name to my apartment deed. That was when I finally understood the taking would never stop. Today, it ends. The ceremony was beautiful. Daniel's vows made me cry. For 45 minutes, I almost believed this day could be perfect. Then the reception began, and my mother reminded me exactly who she was. 200 guests filled the ballroom at the Riverside Country Club. Daniel and I had paid for everything ourselves down to the last centerpiece, but watching my mother work the room, you would think she had written every check. She had positioned herself at the entrance like a general commanding troops. She greeted every guest with a wide smile and a firm handshake. She introduced my brother Eric to anyone who would listen. "This is my son, the entrepreneur. He's working on some very exciting projects." Meanwhile, I stood 3 feet away in my wedding dress, and she didn't even glance in my direction. I had studied the seating chart for weeks. My best friend Rachel was supposed to sit at the table closest to the head table, but when guests started finding their seats, I noticed Rachel wandering toward the back of the room, looking confused. My mother had moved her place card. In its place sat Eric, grinning at me like he had won some kind of prize. 120 guests were from Daniel's side. His family was large and warm and loud in the best way. 50 guests were colleagues from our workplaces, people who actually knew me and respected my work. And 30 guests were from my mother's side. Distant relatives I barely recognized. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. My mother had insisted on inviting them. "Family is family," she had said, as if that word meant anything coming from her mouth. But something was different about my mother today. There was an edge to her energy, a tightness around her eyes that I couldn't quite place. She smiled too wide. She laughed too loud. And every few minutes, her gaze would drift toward me with an expression I had never seen before. It almost looked like fear. I didn't understand it then, but I would soon. The night before at the rehearsal dinner, Eric had said something that seemed innocent at the time. He had raised his glass and asked, "So you're really moving to Portland after the honeymoon? That's pretty far." Daniel and I had accepted job offers in Oregon. New city, new life. 2,500 miles away from Columbus. When Eric said the word Portland, my mother's face had frozen. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to notice. There was a flash of something in her eyes. Calculation, then fear, then nothing hidden behind her usual pleasant mask. I didn't know what she was afraid of. Not yet. What I didn't know was that 2 weeks earlier, my mother had received a letter from American Homeowner Relief Program, LLC. The letter informed her of a change in payment status. For the first time in 7 years, the monthly mortgage payment had not arrived. She didn't understand the legal language, but she understood enough to be terrified. And now her invisible daughter, the one she had dismissed for 26 years, was about to disappear across the country. Throughout the reception, my mother delivered her usual insults. But tonight, they carried a desperate edge that made them sharper than usual. A distant aunt approached me near the cake table. "Amber, you look absolutely beautiful. That dress is stunning." Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow. "Well, she finally learned to dress herself. Only took 36 years. The aunt laughed nervously. I smiled and said nothing. Later, one of Daniel's uncles asked about my career. "I hear you're some kind of financial wizard. Very impressive." My mother cut in before I could answer. "Oh, she does something with spreadsheets. Nothing creative like Eric's businesses. He's the real visionary in the family." I smiled and said nothing. Daniel's mother, Margaret, found me near the bar. She took my hands in hers and said, "Daniel is so lucky to have found you. You're such a wonderful, accomplished woman." My mother materialized from nowhere. She's always been the quiet one. Not much personality, but reliable, I suppose. Like a good appliance. Margaret's face went pale. I smiled and said nothing. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table so hard I thought my fingers might break. Each insult was a test. Each time I stayed silent, my mother's shoulders relaxed a little more. She was checking to make sure I was still the same Amber, still obedient, still invisible, still willing to absorb whatever she threw at me without fighting back. Then came Eric's speech. My mother had volunteered him to speak instead of my maid of honor. Rachel had prepared remarks for weeks, but at the last minute, Mom announced that family should come first. Eric took the microphone with the confidence of someone who had never earned anything in his life. "Growing up," he began, "Amber was always in her room with books while I was out living life, making friends, taking risks. I guess some people are meant to shine and some are meant to support from the shadows." He paused for laughter. A few people chuckled nervously. Amber was never the fun one, never the popular one, but she was always there, in the background, doing her little homework assignments while the rest of us actually experienced the world. He raised his champagne glass high. So here's to Amber, finally finding someone willing to put up with her. Scattered applause, awkward silence. Daniel's mother looked horrified. Rachel gripped her napkin like she was about to throw it at Eric's head. I watched my mother and brother exchange a glance across the room. Eric gave a tiny nod. Mom's shoulders relaxed completely. A message had been delivered and received. We reminded her of her place. I smiled and said nothing. The DJ's voice cut through the tension. And now a few words from the mother of the bride. My mother took the microphone. Her cheeks were flushed. She had been drinking steadily for 2 hours. Champagne courage, my father used to call it. What started as a toast quickly became something else. My daughter Amber. She began her words slightly slurred. Amber left home at 18 and barely looked back. She thinks she's better than us with her fancy job and her fancy apartment. Moving to Portland now. Running away again just like she always does. The room went quiet. Daniel's hand found mine under the table. But let me tell you something. Her voice rose cracking with something that sounded almost like panic. I raised her, I sacrificed for her, and what did I get? A daughter who can't even help her own brother when he needs it. A daughter who's abandoning her family. 200 people stared in frozen silence. The DJ's hand hovered over his equipment, unsure what to do. Somewhere behind me, a child started to cry. My mother's eyes locked onto mine. Wild, desperate, 26 years of resentment and fear pouring out in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. And then she screamed it. The words she had whispered to me my entire life finally spoken aloud for the whole world to hear. You'll never amount to anything. The words echoed off the walls. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And in that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't just cruelty. This was desperation. My mother was terrified of losing control, terrified of losing whatever hold she thought she still had over me. She was right to be afraid. I stood slowly. Every eye in the room followed me as I walked toward the stage. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor. The only sound in the universe. I stopped in front of my mother. Her face was red. Her hands were shaking. She still clutched the microphone like a weapon. I extended my hand toward her, my voice impossibly calm. May I have the microphone, Mom? My mother stared at me like I had grown a second head. This was not the reaction she expected. Where were the tears? Where was the running away? Where was the familiar surrender she had trained into me over 26 years? She handed me the microphone. Her fingers were trembling. Confusion broke through her drunken haze as she tried to understand what was happening. The room held its breath. 200 people watched as I raised the microphone to my lips. I could feel their eyes on me. Daniel's family, my colleagues, the distant relatives my mother had invited to witness what she thought would be another successful demonstration of her control. I looked at my mother, not with anger, not with tears, but with something far more dangerous. Complete calm. I spoke slowly, clearly, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water. I've been funding your life, Mom. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My mother laughed. It was a sharp, nervous sound that bounced off the walls. What are you talking about? She said loud enough for everyone to hear. You've never given us anything. You've always been too selfish to help your own family. I didn't respond. I reached into my purse and pulled out the thick envelope, the one I had been carrying all day, the one that contained 7 years of truth. Document 1, I said, my voice steady as I unfolded the first paper. Mortgage transfer agreement dated 7 years ago. The original lender was First Ohio Bank. The new holder is American Homeowner Relief Program, LLC. My mother's face tightened. Several guests leaned forward in their seats, suddenly interested. Document 2, I continued. Certificate of incorporation for that LLC, filed with the Ohio Secretary of State. Sole owner and registered agent. I paused, letting the moment stretch, letting the silence build. Amber Marie Craig. Gasps scattered through the room like startled birds. I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God." I heard a chair scrape against the floor as someone shifted to get a better view. Document 3, payment records totaling $183,742 over 7 years. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every insurance premium, all from my personal bank accounts processed through legal counsel paid to keep you in the house you were about to lose. I walked to the nearest table and set the papers down, fanning them out so everyone nearby could see. The bank logos, the dates, the amounts. 7 years of sacrifice documented in black and white. The house you live in, I said, turning back to my mother. I hold the mortgage. The government program that saved you from foreclosure 7 years ago? That was me. The low monthly payments you've been making, they go into an escrow account I set up for your future care. My mother's face had gone white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, Linda Mitchell had nothing to say. But I wasn't finished. It doesn't stop there, I said, and I turned to look at my brother. Eric had gone pale. His champagne glass trembled in his hand, the liquid sloshing against the sides. Your auto detailing business, I said, the one that almost made it. When suppliers threatened to sue you for $32,000, I called them directly. I paid. I asked them not to mention my name, but I imagine they slipped up eventually. Eric's jaw tightened. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The food truck that failed, I bought out the $18,000 equipment lease to clear your name. The collection agencies that were calling, I made them stop. I turned back to my mother. Your emergency root canal 3 years ago when insurance denied coverage, I called the dental office. I paid the full amount. And I asked them to tell you the insurance approved it on appeal. My mother's lower lip began to tremble. Tears welled in her eyes. But I had seen her tears before. I had seen them used as weapons, as tools of manipulation, as ways to make me feel guilty for existing. They didn't work anymore. I addressed the room. 200 silent faces staring at me, waiting. So let me ask you all something, I said. My mother just told 200 people that I'll never amount to anything. I locked eyes with her. Then who exactly has been keeping this family afloat for the past 7 years? The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Somewhere in the back of the room, a champagne flute clinked against a table. A woman coughed. A child whispered a question to her parent. My mother stood frozen, her carefully constructed image crumbling around her like wet paper in rain. I spoke to the room one final time. I'm not sharing this to humiliate anyone. I'm sharing it because for 26 years, I've been told I'm not enough. I'm selfish. I don't care about family. My voice softened, but it didn't break. I wouldn't give her that. The truth is, I cared too much. I cared so much that I saved them in silence, hoping that someday, somehow they would see me. They never did. I turned to my mother, who stood alone on the stage, stripped of every lie she had ever told about me. The payments stopped 2 weeks ago. They're not starting again. My lawyer will contact you about the property. It's time you figured things out on your own. I set down the microphone gently on the nearest table. The soft thud echoed through the silent room. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Daniel stood up from his seat. He began to clap. Alone at first, his applause echoing in the cavernous space. Then Rachel joined him. My best friend, who had been exiled to a back table, stood and clapped with tears streaming down her face. Then Daniel's mother, Margaret. Then a few of my colleagues from work. Then some of Daniel's cousins who had witnessed everything. The applause didn't sweep the room. Most guests remained frozen in their seats, still processing the earthquake they had just witnessed. But it grew scattered and genuine as pockets of people found the courage to acknowledge what they had seen. I stepped off the stage and walked toward Daniel. He met me halfway, taking my hand in his. His grip was warm and steady. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. I looked back at the stage one last time. My mother stood there alone, surrounded by empty space. The guests at nearby tables had physically moved their chairs away from her. Eric had disappeared somewhere, probably hiding in the bathroom. For 26 years, my mother had controlled the narrative. She was the long-suffering parent. I was the ungrateful daughter. Eric was the golden child who just needed more time to find himself. In 5 minutes, I had rewritten the entire story. I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight I had been carrying since I was 10 years old, since my father died, and my mother decided I wasn't worth loving, finally lifted from my shoulders. Daniel and I walked toward the exit, and guests parted to let us through. Some reached out to touch my arm. Some whispered words of support. Some just nodded with respect in their eyes. But as we stepped into the cool night air, something gnawed at me, a splinter in my mind that I couldn't quite identify. My mother's panic tonight. It had started before my speech. Eric's knowing glances throughout the reception, the way they exchanged that look during his toast, as if confirming something between them. And something else, something I had noticed but hadn't processed. They never seemed surprised by my successes, only annoyed by them, as if my accomplishments were an inconvenience rather than a shock. I had spent 7 years believing I was invisibly helping an ungrateful family, but what if the truth was darker than that? What if they knew more than they ever let on? I didn't have answers yet, but standing in the parking lot of the Riverside Country Club holding my husband's hand on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. The truth I revealed tonight was only half the story. The darker half was still waiting to be discovered. The darker half found me 3 months later in the dusty attic of my childhood home, surrounded by boxes my mother couldn't be bothered to take with her. But first, let me tell you what happened in those 3 months. Because watching my mother's carefully constructed world collapse was something I never expected to witness. Within a week of the wedding, the story had spread through the extended family like wildfire. Someone had recorded my speech on their cell phone. The video circulated through family group chats forwarded from cousin to cousin, aunt to uncle. By the following Monday, everyone knew. My Aunt Martha called me first. She was my mother's younger sister, and for my entire life, she had stayed neutral in family matters, but not anymore. "Amber," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I always knew something was wrong with how Linda treated you. I saw it at every holiday dinner, every birthday party. The way she looked at you versus the way she looked at Eric. I'm sorry I never spoke up. I should have said something years ago." Uncle George called the next day. "Your mother used to brag about Eric to everyone," he told me. "Every family gathering, it was Eric this, Eric that. She barely mentioned your name. We all noticed. We just didn't want to get involved. That was wrong of us." One by one, relatives who had stayed silent for 26 years found their voices. They called to apologize. They sent cards. They shared stories about things they had witnessed but never addressed. The family's open secret was finally being spoken aloud. And my mother, the woman who had commanded every room, who had controlled every narrative, who had positioned herself as the long-suffering matriarch of a difficult family. She found herself suddenly completely alone. Holiday invitations stopped arriving. The friends who had admired her devoted mother image stopped returning her calls. The neighbors who used to wave from across the street now pretended not to see her. In the span of a few weeks, Linda Mitchell went from the center of her social universe to a woman no one wanted to know. Eric's collapse was even faster. Without my invisible safety net, his carefully maintained illusion crumbled within weeks. His new business loan application was denied immediately. It turns out that a credit history full of debts, mysteriously paid off by unknown parties, doesn't look as impressive as he thought. Banks want to see that you can actually pay your own bills. His leased BMW was repossessed 2 weeks after the wedding. He had been 3 months behind on payments. I don't know where he thought that money was going to come from, but it wasn't coming from me anymore. His apartment eviction followed a month later. 2 months of unpaid rent. Money that used to flow through my mother's household ultimately sourced from my bank account without anyone ever admitting it. At 33 years old, my brother Eric filled out a job application for the first time in his life. 2 weeks later, he started work as a warehouse stalker at a distribution center. Minimum wage. Night shifts, steel-toed boots. This wasn't revenge. This was simply reality without a cushion. The safety net I had spent 7 years weaving in secret was gone, and Eric finally had to learn what the ground felt like. The house was next. With my mortgage payments stopped, the foreclosure clock started ticking. My lawyer sent official notice to my mother. The property would be foreclosed in 90 days if the debt wasn't satisfied. She had 2 choices: let the foreclosure happen and destroy her credit score forever, or sell the house voluntarily and pay off the mortgage from the proceeds. She chose to sell. The house listed for $285,000. It sold in 6 weeks to a young couple expecting their first child. After paying off my mortgage balance and the closing costs, my mother received approximately $42,000. Enough for a few years of modest rent in a small apartment. Nothing more. The day the sold sign went up in front of the house, Aunt Martha sent me a photo. I stared at it for a long time on my phone screen. In the corner of the frame, I could see my father's oak tree, the one he planted the year I was born, the one I had spent $183,000 trying to save. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt finished, like closing a book I had been reading for far too long. 1 month after the closing, I drove back to Ohio. My mother had promised to leave some of my father's belongings for me to collect. His books from the study, his old watch, a photo album from before I was born. Small things, but they were all I had left of him. My mother had already moved to her new apartment. The house was empty when I arrived, stripped of furniture and memories. The walls were bare. The rooms echoed with my footsteps. The new owners wouldn't take possession for another week. I found the box of my father's things in the living room, right where my mother said it would be. But something drew me upstairs. Call it instinct, call it fate, call it whatever you want. In the attic, among the dust and cobwebs and forgotten Christmas decorations, I found a cardboard box my mother hadn't bothered to take. Inside were old papers, receipts, and a worn leather notebook I recognized immediately. My mother's household journal. She had kept it for as long as I could remember. Grocery lists, appointment reminders, notes to herself about bills and errands. I opened it. The handwriting was her distinctive cursive, the same handwriting that had signed my report cards without comment for years. The first entry that caught my eye was dated 7 years ago, 2 months after I had set up the LLC. Got a call from Harold Bennett's office today. Apparently Amber bought our mortgage through some company. She's the one making the payments. Eric thinks we should say something. I said absolutely not. If she knows we know, she'll want credit. She'll want to be thanked. Let her keep thinking she's invisible. She's used to it. The money keeps coming either way. My hands began to shake. I turned the pages. 5 years ago, Eric's supplier called and let slip that Amber paid off his debt. Stupid girl used her real name. Eric wanted to send her a thank you card. I told him no. The moment we acknowledge it, she'll stop giving. Or worse, she'll think she's part of the family again. Keep her feeling guilty, keep her invisible. She'll keep paying. 3 years ago, dental office almost ruined everything. They told me Amber paid my bill. I pretended I didn't hear it. Told Eric we need to be more careful. We can't let Amber know that we know. The gravy train only runs if she thinks we don't see her. 1 year ago, Eric's making a list of things we can ask Amber for later. Her apartment equity, co-signing his loans, maybe help with retirement. She's got money and she's desperate for our love. We just have to keep her desperate. I sat on the dusty attic floor, the notebook trembling in my hands. For 7 years, I thought I was invisibly helping an ungrateful family. I thought they didn't know. I thought they were simply blind to my sacrifices, too self-absorbed to notice. The truth was so much worse. They saw everything, every payment, every sacrifice, every desperate attempt to earn their love, and they chose to keep hurting me. They chose to keep me feeling worthless, because my pain was profitable. That night, I called my mother. I found your notebook in the attic, Mom. Long silence on the other end. I read it, all of it, the entries about keeping me invisible so I'd keep paying, Eric's list of future asks, your plan to keep me desperate. Her voice came through small and defensive. You don't understand. You were always so independent, so successful. You didn't need us to be grateful. You had everything. We had nothing. I had nothing, I said. My voice was ice. I had a family that saw me as an ATM, that deliberately kept me feeling worthless so I'd keep giving. That's not neglect, Mom. That's a con. Amber, please. Don't contact me again. You have the apartment. You have the trust fund for basic rent. That's more than you deserve, and it's more than you'll ever get from me again. I hung up. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. Some betrayals are too complete for grief. I put down the phone and stared at the wall of my Portland apartment. 26 years of wondering why I was never enough. 26 years of trying harder, giving more, shrinking smaller. 26 years of believing that if I just loved them enough, they would eventually love me back. Now I knew the truth. I was exactly enough. I was exactly what they needed. A silent, self-doubting ATM who would never ask for acknowledgement. For the first time, my pain transformed into something else entirely. Clarity. Clarity became the foundation of everything I built after that. 1 year after the wedding, I stood in the kitchen of a small craftsman house outside Portland watching my husband throw a tennis ball for our golden retriever in the backyard. The dog's name was Biscuit, and we had adopted her from a shelter 3 months after we moved. She bounded across the grass with the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that I was only beginning to understand. The house wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a wraparound porch that sold us the moment we saw it. We found it during our 3rd week of house hunting, and Daniel turned to me in the driveway and said, "This is it, isn't it?" I nodded before I could even think about it. Some things you just know. Sunday morning sunlight poured through the windows as I poured my coffee. The house was modest, but entirely ours. No secrets hidden in the walls. No debts carried for people who didn't deserve it. No one else's failures weighing on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, my money went toward my own future, my own family, my own peace. The feeling still surprised me sometimes. It felt like wearing clothes that finally fit after decades of squeezing into sizes too small. I learned about Eric through Aunt Martha. She was the only relative from my mother's side who maintained contact with me, and I was grateful for her. She never asked me to forgive anyone. She just kept me informed like a news reporter covering a distant country I used to live in. Eric still worked at the warehouse. 8 months in, he had been promoted to shift supervisor. An extra $2.50 an hour. When Aunt Martha told me, she said he talked about it like it was a victory. And maybe it was. For a man who had never earned anything in his life, learning that hard work could lead to small rewards must have felt like discovering a new language. He rented a studio apartment now, paid his own utilities, cooked his own meals. For the first time in 33 years, my brother knew exactly how much money he had because he had earned all of it himself. He even reached out to Aunt Martha to apologize for years of borrowing money he never repaid. He had paid back $200 so far. He said he would pay back the rest eventually. Aunt Martha didn't hold her breath, but she appreciated the gesture. He's not a new person, she told me during one of our phone calls. But he's finally becoming a real one. Maybe that's something. Eric had tried to contact me 3 times since the wedding. Text messages that started with, "I know you probably hate me, but," I never responded. Not because I hated him. The truth was simpler than that. I had nothing left to say. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. Walking back across them only leads to places you've already escaped. My mother's fall was thorough but quiet, which somehow made it more complete. The house sold. After paying off my mortgage balance and the closing costs, she received $42,000. It went faster than she expected. Bad financial habits don't change at 63. She had spent her whole life believing that money would always appear from somewhere, and she never learned what to do when it stopped. She rented a small 1-bedroom apartment in a cheaper part of town now. The trust fund I had set up, a final gesture of basic humanity rather than forgiveness, covered the rent. Exactly the rent. Nothing more, no extra cushion, no emergency fund. Just enough to keep a roof over her head, because despite everything, I couldn't be the person who let her become homeless. My mother worked part-time as a grocery store cashier, 25 hours a week. Standing on her feet for entire shifts, scanning items, asking customers if they found everything okay. The woman who once commanded every family gathering now wore a name tag and stocked shelves during her breaks. She had not apologized, not once. In the 3 attempts she made to contact me, the word sorry never appeared. Only explanations, justifications, requests for more money, complaints about how hard her life had become, as if she had no idea how she got there. I no longer expected an apology. Some people are incapable of them. Their pride is more important than their relationships. Their need to be right outweighs their need to be loved. Accepting that my mother would never say sorry was its own kind of freedom. I stopped waiting for something that was never going to come. The hardest lesson I learned in my 37 years was this: family is not blood. Family is choice. My real family gathered around my dinner table on my birthday that year. 8 people who loved me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Daniel sat at the head of the table, still apologizing for burning the garlic bread for the 3rd time in a row. He had walked away from his own toxic parents years before we met. He understood what it cost to choose yourself over people who were supposed to love you. He never once made me feel small. He never once made me doubt my worth. Margaret, Daniel's mother, sat next to him with a glass of wine in her hand. She had cried at our wedding before the speech because she was so happy her son had found someone with such a good heart. She called me every Sunday now. She sent me recipes and articles and pictures of flowers from her garden. She treated me like a daughter, and I had never known what that felt like until I met her. Priya and James sat across from each other, their toddler between them, in a high chair, throwing pasta at anyone within range. They were my closest friends, the ones who had witnessed my transformation over the years, and never once said, "I told you so." They just showed up, they just stayed, and Aunt Martha, who had driven all the way from Ohio for my birthday. The only bridge to my past worth keeping. The relative who finally spoke up when it mattered. She sent me photos of my father's oak tree every spring when it bloomed, even though it stood in someone else's yard now. A small reminder that some things survive, even when everything around them changes. I looked around the table at these faces. None of them shared my DNA. All of them shared my life. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Chaotic and warm and imperfect, and completely wonderful. Later that night, while unpacking the last box from storage, I found the leather notebook from my mother's attic. I had taken it as evidence, proof, a reminder of what I had survived. I opened it to the final entry she had written, the words I had read 100 times. She's got money and she's desperate for our love. We just have to keep her desperate. For a long moment, I sat with it. These words that once would have shattered me. These words that had shattered me for a little while when I first discovered them. Then I picked up a pen and turned to the last blank page in the notebook. I wrote my own entry in my own handwriting. You were wrong, Mom. I was never desperate for your love. I was desperate to be the daughter you deserved, but you didn't deserve one, and I was never the problem. I closed the notebook. I placed it in a box. I labeled the box with a marker, proof that I was always enough. Then I put it on the highest shelf in my closet, where I would probably never look at it again. I walked back to the kitchen where Daniel was attempting to grill steaks on the back porch, and Margaret was supervising with helpful criticism. Biscuit was underfoot, hoping for scraps. The evening light slanted golden through the windows. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was turning pink over the mountains. The air smelled like summer and charcoal and possibility. I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who taped her broken glasses because her needs didn't matter. The one who left home at 18 with nothing. The one who spent 26 years trying to earn love from people who only wanted her money. That girl saved her family anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because she didn't know she deserved better. Now I know. My mother told me I would never amount to anything. She was right by her definition. I never became someone she could love. I never earned her pride. I never won the game she designed for me to lose. But here's what took me 37 years to understand: I was never supposed to win her game. I was supposed to stop playing. My worth was never in her hands. It was always in mine. I just forgot that for 26 years. If you are hearing this and you recognize yourself somewhere in my story, the one who gives everything and receives nothing, the one who carries invisible weight while being told you are not enough, please hear me. You are not the problem. You were never the problem. And someday when you are ready, you will stop playing their game. That is when your real life begins. Thank you for staying with me through Amber's story until the very end. This story carries a message that I hope will stay with you long after you finish listening. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most become the ones who hurt us the deepest. They take our kindness for weakness. They mistake our silence for permission. They use our love as a tool to control us. But here's the truth that Amber learned, and that I hope you will remember: your worth is not determined by people who refuse to see it. You are not responsible for earning love from those who have already decided not to give it. And walking away from toxic relationships, even family relationships, is not selfish. It is survival. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in Amber's journey, or if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to walk away from someone who didn't deserve your love? What gave you the strength to finally let go? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.